from up here, but there are theoretically microphones that you'll be able to talk into. I guess if it feels absolutely necessary, you could just shout out questions during the presentation. Hopefully I'll delight you enough to make that interesting. So I was delighted this morning by our eye contact and hugging exercise, and I noticed that, so far as I could tell, I don't know who else noticed this, there was less eye contact than there was hugging. So as a kid, believe it or not, I was definitely not comfortable with eye contact at all. And I bet you can tell from this picture, though it seems strange, I was a super, super nerdy kid. Those are my first 4 computers. What I want to do, what I think is going to be fun, my personal story, my life story, and my technology experiences, I think in many ways are a story that is threaded into and is a metaphor and a fractal, if you will, for the whole story of technology and the internet and how it's changing us. So keep that in mind, or think about that. So as a little kid, I was initially a big reader, and I got into electronics when I was still very young. In 4th grade, I made, for show and tell, regaled my peers with an analog computer that I had built out of resistors and a meter, and they promptly, although I was doing well in school, I got, oh, are we cutting out? Is it? I'm standing in the wrong. Okay. That does sound better. It's hard to enunciate with these things, isn't it? So as a kid, I discovered electronics early. I made an analog computer, but I was also very, very shy and uncomfortable, and retook 4th grade again just so that I could not be as too socially retarded as I grew up. Once computers became available, this first one I bought on the upper left there was at a swap meet. I think it was $20 or $25. Those first 2 computers at the top there, the Timex Sinclair and the Commodore 64, I couldn't afford storage devices. So my first year or so of programming, I would program things all day, and then at the end of it, I had to just turn the computer off, and it was all lost. I don't know what effect that has on you as an entrepreneur, but I didn't even think about it for this, but it's got to have one. So yeah, I'd code all day, and then I would just turn the computer off. So let's talk about risk for a second. My dad sent me this picture recently. When I got about to high school, being both, into computers and electronics and also very handy with a saw, I decided that the coolest thing that a guy my age could possibly do would be to make the door in my bedroom go up into the attic, a la Star Trek, straight up and down, rather than opening normally. And to do that, I mounted a garage door opener, which I also bought at the swap meet, in my attic, and a rope that went down and pulled this door up. But to get the door to open and go all the way up high enough into the attic, you still had to duck under it a little. I had to cut through 2 main ceiling joists of the house. They're repaired now with that beam on the back, but you can imagine, this is a house in Southern California, a popular earthquake destination, and I cut these 2 long ceiling joists, and my dad, who now is strangely an architect, sent me this picture just a few months ago saying, well, I finally fixed that little problem. But even in Silicon Valley, and I think some sense especially in Silicon Valley and in the technology world, and I'm going to talk about this, real risk-taking is pretty rare. I think that the really crazy entrepreneurs take real risks. They aren't motivated by money. They are just crazy. They are usually motivated, I usually actually laughingly think they usually have some kind of a troubled childhood. They almost always fail with the really big, crazy projects. And these people are very rare, and they irrationally pursue ideas that are unlikely to work, generally because they just can't get them out of their heads. I think that the technology world fantasizes that it's mostly made up of people like these, but part of what I want to talk about here as we meditate about, for example, this place versus Silicon Valley versus Seattle versus everywhere, is this idea that most of the people in the technology world aren't that crazy. They aren't taking real substantial risks. So going back to my own technology journey, as I got into computers, I had a couple of formative experiences that were really powerful. One, this is kind of the how techie are you question for the crowd and calibrate. How many people know what the colored image is up there? Like, show of hands. Like, kind of what that is. Oh boy, that's really only a few. Okay, so that's the Mandelbrot set. So the tougher one is, does anybody know what the other image is? Yes, cellular automata. So my friend and I remember scanning around. The Mandelbrot set is a beautiful curly-Q image which has the unusual property that you can zoom into it indefinitely, as much as you want, and you just keep getting these amazing images that have finer and finer detail. So you can just zoom in and zoom in and zoom into that picture, and it never stops, and you never see the same image twice. You can wander into the zoom of that picture forever and never see the same thing twice, and never, you can find a completely different sort of field of strange little animals in color every time you do it. And my friend and I were doing this one day, and we looked at the screen that we were on, having zoomed down about 15 times, and we calculated that the initial image, which looked something like that we started with, was at this point the size of the surface of the Earth. And we were looking at but one little 12-inch square on our computer screen. And that, combined with experiments in cellular automata, convinced me that computers and digital worlds had the possibility to simulate more than we had as yet even created on Earth. That somehow inside those computers there could be more stuff. There could be more creativity. There could be more of us, or more of everything in there, inside those machines, than we had in the real world, or would ever find in space or anything. So that, for me, was the thing that I could not get out of my head, was this idea that somehow I wanted to take the internet and everybody's computers and connect it all together in some sort of a gigantic grid, which would be this big blank virtual world, the new continent. So after a couple of startup adventures, selling a company, moving to Seattle for 3.5 years, working at Real Networks, waiting patiently until the technology came of age, which was broadband and the graphics coprocessor, I got a chance to build that world, which is Second Life. This is a picture that no one's ever, a few people inside the company have seen, but this is really fun. Like, how many people have actually been in Second Life? Oh, cool, thank you, that's cool. This is actually what it would look like if there weren't any limits on the rendering. So this is what Second Life would look like if you slowly render essentially the entire world. So you can see how rich the environment is when you can see everything that was made in it. In fact, there are billions of objects have been created by people inside Second Life, and hundreds of millions of dollars a year in transactions where people are buying these and selling these objects, furniture, plants, homes, clothing, jewelry, to each other in this virtual world. At our peak, there were like hundreds of articles a day being written about Second Life. And the reason I make this point about mass was that, honestly, looking back on it, I think my kind of geeky desire to build this strange, unfathomably weird blank canvas, I don't actually know why it became such a media chord, why everybody got so excited about Second Life, or at least I didn't know at the time why it became such a phenomenon. And I actually didn't, as an entrepreneur, design for it. I don't think it was the stuff as much as it was the avatar. So the weird thing about Second Life was that as a little kid, as a nerdy little kid, I just wanted to build a world that was like this huge Lego kit. But the people I worked with, and eventually me too, I reluctantly concluded that we should build these digital bodies into the thing, and that you should actually walk around, literally, in this virtual world with this digital body that you could customize and make your own and use to project your identity into it. Well, the experience of the avatar, that experience of projecting identity, was so compelling that I think it amplified all those billions of objects that were being created. It amplified the experience in some unusual way that I didn't quite understand. That is, the social interaction and the ability people had to interact with each other was amazing, and it was somehow different than anything I had imagined would happen. In particular, people had this sort of lowered interaction barrier. They would They would do things with each other like date and get married and talk and start businesses together, and two developers would share ideas with each other, and they would do all these unusual things that after a while, as the evidence mounted, you could tell were not things that people were going to normally do in real life. That is, two people in this room working, say, as entrepreneurs on a project would not, you won't communicate together quite as well as you often would inside Second Life. And that amplification, that social connection, which I myself was so uncomfortable with, especially as a child, had something to do with why Second Life was so successful. People were in there, there was an experiment in Second Life where people with Asperger's syndrome, which is mild autism, would go in and essentially practice at making eye contact and being social in these very real but virtual situations inside Second Life. And then as studies were done on that, it demonstrated that they come back to the real world and actually be able to make eye contact. So there was real value being created. But it had something to do with this tremendous idea of being in a different space and being literally present there. Around the same time, the company, Second Life, I was this young CEO, having not done this before, and my company was growing to the scale and was a project of such complexity that I became convinced that the way we managed the company needed to be experimented with, that we wouldn't be able to build something as complicated as this big virtual world that was itself like an operating system plus the internet, just a mess of parts, unless we had a really radical way of looking at how we work together. And around the same time, I read this wonderful book by Tom Malone, which basically made the point that curiously enough, 300 years ago, these two upstart countries, the United States and France, decided to go with the insane idea that you might use a sort of a democratic system in which you empowered citizens to actually decide how much rice to send from one part of the country to the other by market forces, by just letting them take responsibility for the problem. And back then, nobody thought that kind of an insane idea, that kind of decentralized, crowd-thinking strategy for running a country could possibly work. And of course, it worked extremely well. And this guy, Tom Malone, posited that isn't the way we work together, the businesses that you're working on out there today, isn't the way we all work together, isn't that also due for some kind of a revolution? There was another guy won the Nobel Prize in 1991 for work he did in 1932. Usually they deal with the Nobel Prize. He's an economist. And he wrote about how companies exist because it's cheaper to negotiate a salary than it is to negotiate a contract. And I found this idea really interesting because what I thought was, if things like Second Life and technology and Twitter and Square make it easier and easier for people to negotiate little pieces of work with each other, then isn't the whole nature of companies going to change? If we no longer need to give each other salaries and we can just kind of do it all on a job-by-job basis, something profound is going to happen. And so I got really interested in this, and I just started building different experiments in how we work together. And by the way, if any of this stuff, particularly these next 3 slides, intrigues you and it's things you'd like to do in your own company, I'm here till Saturday. Come and talk to me about it, and I'm happy to help you. They're interesting things. The first one was this idea called the love machine, funnily named, because I thought it would get everybody's attention. When the company was about 50 people at Second Life, 2005, we launched this system in which anyone could send a 1-sentence message to anybody else in the company thanking them for doing work. You got a little email in your inbox, said, "Love from Philip, fast work with Omaha founder data." Made you feel wonderful. It was free. You could give it out to anybody at any time. But the incredible power of it, once we all started enjoying and using that system, and we totally loved it, was that the dashboard, for example, of the word cloud, and this is actually a recent one from Linden Lab, gave an incredibly powerful view to me as the CEO at the time of what was actually going on inside the company. So if you looked at the trail of love that people were sending, and if you looked at the contents of these little messages in a statistical analysis, you actually had the most accurate dashboard of what was going on in the company, much better than anything a group of managers could compile for you. The other thing was that the history of love someone received became an incredibly important piece of their performance review. So all the messages other people had sent you, given that they send them frequently enough to you, compared to other people and looked at against your work history, became this very powerful tool for reviewing people's performance. So that was the first experiment. The second question that I asked, and I've continued to do this with my new company, and it worked very well at Linden Lab as well, is, well, if you have all this transparency and if you have a reasonable degree of autonomy in the company and you have transparency where everybody can see what everybody else is doing, which was created by creating the love machine, couldn't you do this crazy experiment and actually, rather than having managers decide how to give out bonuses or stock options to people, why not just have everybody do it? So if your company consists of all the people in this room, the experiment that I did that we do today and that worked incredibly well was the following. If you guys all work together in a company, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you each get $1,000. You have 48 hours to anonymously, and in any manner you choose, give that $1,000 away to everybody else in the company other than you. You can give, if you want, you can give the $1,000 to one person. You can give $3 to everybody. Whatever you want to do, it's up to you. It's actually important that you don't talk about this with each other, and it doesn't matter what your strategy is. So it turns out in the end, you can test whether that's an effective strategy in a variety of ways. You can ask your existing executives to actually, write on a slip of paper like Clue, and put in an envelope the people that they think should get the biggest bonuses. Then you can run this process and you can see who actually ends up getting the big bonuses. In the end, it turns out that those same people that your executives would have picked anyway show up in exactly the same relative positions on that graph, who gets the most bonuses. But in addition to that, two things happen. One is the people who, a number of people who do smaller, less easily recognized jobs at the company, or who do heroic work in the trenches for you, a couple of those people show up in the top 10 every time, which is incredibly awesome and empowering for the company. A normal team of managers is not bad meaning. They just do not have the cognitive energy or time to discover who those people were who deserve that pay. And then the second and most important thing is that even if this process didn't work any better than a normal bonus process, think of the cultural impact. Think how great it feels to have a company where the management is absolved of performance review and can focus entirely on leadership and strategy and evangelism, which is really what great leaders and managers do and should have all their time to do. So that was another experiment that I did with this passion of figuring out how to work differently and decentralize. The third one was, if you can decentralize an organization and let everybody evaluate things for themselves and give them autonomy and use market forces to regulate things, why have a CEO at all? Well, there is actually a very real answer to that. You want to have a CEO because you never want to have a company in which everybody votes on the next thing to do. If voting or consensus or even market processes amongst a lot of people are used to determine strategy, you don't get the whole technology community that most people here are a part of. You don't get entrepreneurship because nobody is dumb enough, if you take a vote on it, to go after a big new idea. It takes, as Seth so well said, it takes a crazy leader. And in fact, if everybody votes against your idea, then it may actually be a big one. And you may really want to do it. So you need a CEO. You need to entrust that CEO to do crazy stuff to see if he or she can make the company survive and find its next great product. But how do you evaluate them, right? Now, traditionally, the board evaluates them. God, from my earlier slide, evaluates and decides whether they should continue to hold their job as a CEO or not. But really, if you had enough guts, and you think about this stuff a lot, you know the right answer, right? Which is, give the CEO a year in that position, and then do a SurveyMonkey survey. And this is exactly what I did at Second Life. I would ask the simple question, in a forced choice, would you rather keep me as the CEO or find a new one? I didn't even give you a, no change or I don't know option. And on the next day, I would share that data with the whole company. Now, can you imagine what the participation rate is on an anonymous survey in which you ask whether everybody wants to keep you as the CEO? So, in addition to that, I'd ask people to send me a little text. And this, by the way, is something everybody in here that leads a company should do. Even if you have a team of 5 people, trust me, this is really interesting. You use SurveyMonkey, you make it anonymous, and you ask people why. Like, what do you think of me? Send it to me anonymously. I used to go home and have like several glasses of wine or whiskey, and then read through these. I love that. Better the devil you know. That's just awesome. That's real stuff. That's 8/7/2007. So this is actually an ideal process for evaluating I believe this is an ideal process for evaluating the performance of senior management in an environment which is essentially more of a market-based or decentralized company. So those were the things that I did during my time at Second Life, and they were really cool experiments that happened inside the confines of a traditional company. But can you take it farther than that? Can you get even crazier than doing those three things and, you know, radically trying to change how work works inside an organization? Well, about 2.5 years ago, my co-founder Ryan and I took off to start Coffee and Power. And the first thing we said was, we absolutely refuse to have an office at all. In fact, we're going to work out of bars and cafes. The bar thing, the whole bar idea, in retrospect, only lasted a couple of days. It's harder to work, even as an optimistic, strong-willed person, it's difficult to work in a bar. But so we ended up going on this long tour of 20 or 25 coffee shops, basically, cafes in San Francisco that were our favorite places to work. And we literally just text each other in the morning. And along the way, we started listening and learning about what was happening there. And in addition to that, because we were working out of coffee shops, we basically also challenged ourselves to build a software development company, a funded software development startup that didn't have anybody working at it, because you really only could have like another 1 or maybe 2 people show up at the coffee shop with you every day. So we built something called the Work List, and the Work List is a system that is a really radical experiment in which we created a system kind of like a crash collision between something like Elance or Odesk and GitHub and open source and a chat room. We basically made a system where we broke software development down into tiny little steps of maybe 4 hours of work, something somebody as a developer might charge you $200 to do, and we parallelized it. So at any given time we have 40 different little jobs going on, and people are checking in code 6 or 7 times a day, and everybody can see the source code and chat with everybody else that's working on our projects. And so with the Work List, we started being able to build a lot of software very fast. In fact, Coffee and Power version 1, which was our first shot at a generalized user-to-user service market, was built by 63 people, $229,000, 11 months. That's pretty good. That's like 2.0 people years in Silicon Valley terms. And it happened really fast and really well, and the product is elegant and cool, even though you've got a whole bunch of people working that don't even know each other. So we demonstrated that you can build an elegant product. Now, a moment about user-to-user marketplaces, which many people here are following. In fact, Zarly is here. It's a great company and a great, what would you call Zarly? A great sort of a child and a partner of this whole gang, right? Zarly and Bo. What I think is happening with the user-to-user services market, and it's fascinating, is the one thing that works really well that these companies are doing in building these sort of small job marketplaces is creating what I think of as almost a new kind of Starbucks. That is, if you're a college student and you need extra money, you're ultimately going to sign up in the future to be a service provider on one of these services. And I think they're going to be very successful. And I think it's going to be a more interesting job to do as a college student than serving coffee. But what about the case where you are trying to get skilled people, like the many entrepreneurs and developers and designers that are here today, to work together under kind of non-salary, non-standard conditions? The answer is it's really hard. There's $1 trillion in all of us building things in the technology market. Any CEO will tell you that like 10 or 20% of that work now is not salaried anymore. It's like contract engagements of one kind or another. And yet, The freelancing sites and the many other systems, including ours, that have attempted to get people to do software work together have failed. Well, I shouldn't say they've failed. Actually, they make some money. But as you can see from that percentage, they actually make a surprisingly tiny fraction of work, even though we're going in this direction. So where is everybody? So to meditate on this question a little bit, and delighted by coming here, I took a look at some data. We pulled some interesting data, which is we said, how many people on LinkedIn identify themselves as technology co-founders? Turns out you can do this search on LinkedIn. And the question we asked was, each of these, for Omaha, Des Moines, and Kansas City, each of these is an area on the map, which hopefully, if I got it right, encompasses about 100,000 people. And hopefully you guys recognize the maps and their relative size. The red dots represent technical co-founders. In other words, if you're in the technology business, someone that could give you your next job. Now ask yourself, is that a lot of dots? In many cases, those are spread out by more than like a mile from each other. If some great, amazing person with an amazing new idea is working today in a banking job here in one of these 3 cities, and they're thinking about striking out on their own, are they really safe to do it? Regardless of investment capital that's available, their skill, passion, and quality, or even the sheer number of people with whom they might possibly work. The answer, I think, is not right now, but this is something that could change very quickly. So in the next slide, what I did was I said, well, let's look at 2 other cities that are relevant here. So the answer is, there's only 51. So there's in Omaha, I believe there's 21 co-founders per 100,000 people. In New York, the number's 51. In Los Angeles, the number's 40. It's actually not much better. So being a developer in New York only differs from being a developer here in that it's worse because the cost of living is incredibly high. But you're still unlikely to meet somebody to give you your next job in a bar in New York. That's the Lower East Side, basically, that you're looking at. But look at San Francisco. And like I said, in many ways, we seek safety. We're smart that way as humans. We're herd animals. We support each other. It's a wonderful quality. We don't, going back to that second slide in my cut joists, we don't usually every day want to take crazy, insane risks. What we'd like to do is work on what our heart leads us to, and we'd like to have a little bit of safety and security in doing that. I would say to you that the reason why San Francisco is a compelling destination for technology startups has nothing to do with people having better access to information or intelligence or skill or design or experience or anything in that area. The only thing it has anything to do with is the fact that you basically can't go into a bar in San Francisco without tripping over somebody who basically could hire you if your current startup fails. So San Francisco isn't like a big, we're such big, swaggering, risk-taking dreamers, you know, flying our own, Howard Hughes airplanes around all day and, talking about the next great, how we're going to travel into space. We're people that are interested in developing software and working on small software ideas who can't screw up because we're surrounded by other people who do the same thing. So basically, it's a fascinating thought, and it's one that I really wanted to throw out here because I think that as technology changes us and as we become, as technology invariably changes us, and indeed this is what we're working on at Coffee and Power, what we're going to see is that it doesn't take much to create enough fusion, to create that kind of San Francisco-ish density from that slide. It doesn't take much to use technology to get to that slide on the lower right. And I think that it could happen here, and I bet that it will happen somewhere soon. One of the other examples of this, we started wandering around and looking at these co-working spaces, which is this revolution of people, there's such a density of development, and I know there's co-working spaces here too. I think there's a couple that are opening, and this wonderful space has a bunch of this type of stuff happening in it, where people that don't work together are camping out in these spaces and using them as kind of, as offices, basically. And again, there's enough startups that this actually works. But when I started crawling around these spaces as a sort of an anthropologist, what I really expected to see was kind of, deadly serious startups that were hardcore and heads down working on the next release of their thing and kind of, paying $250 a month for a desk because it's cheaper than finding a south of market sublease. But what I actually found was almost like a scene from The Office. What I found when I looked in these co-working spaces was people trying to reconstruct the world that they had known in the language of the traditional office, even though they didn't all work together. That upper right picture is people celebrating a birthday at a place called Sandbox Suites. So they literally stop and celebrate and have blowout candles and have birthday parties for people. This is South of Market in San Francisco, rather than working on their startups. People come to these spaces for social contact, not for market efficiency. So the thing that's so interesting there is we're reconstructing, we're attempting, in the face of ruthlessly efficient markets and increasingly smaller and smaller companies and more freelancing, in the face of that, we're trying to reconstruct some kind of community. And that's what we're working on with Coffee and Power. These are just a few screens from our app. Nobody's seen these. I took them yesterday and put them up. And if you come up, I can give you this app, or there's kind of an early version of it. But basically, imagine an app that took people in Omaha, for example, and made all the people that were doing technology development, kind of crammed everybody into a small space. I think literally, by the way, that would be a wonderful thing to happen in one of these cities, would be to actually create a kind of a dormitory for developers and let people actually live together and share a workspace and share living spaces as a way of increasing socialization and reducing that sense of risk. Make it feel like an office. That's my advice. I think that's actually going to work. And what we're trying to do with Coffee and Power is build an application that kind of, through the lens either of people or of places, gives you an ability to reach out, chat with, have a group chat with, give recognition to people who are helping you as a function of their skill set. So if you're traveling, you'll bring this thing up here, and you'll literally see little dots on all the places where other people have checked in and done work, so that you can basically go and hang out in the place where maybe the person that's a designer will show up that day because you need someone to help you with design. And so what we're trying to do with this app is anticipate this sort of future of work. The last thought I had, and then we'll stop and take some questions. I heard somebody laugh. I hoped somebody would laugh. Does everybody get it? Do I need to say anything to this slide? So, as I watched Second Life evolve, the people that were the most successful inside Second Life were networkers. They were connected. The people creating businesses, buying and selling land, they were unusual. They weren't the nomadic cowboys that dotted the historic past of both great companies and the tech revolution. They were these very high eye contact connectors that were manipulating a social graph. In many cases, they were women. Much more so women than men. And I don't know how many emails I've seen in the last 2 days. I was just noticing it. Maybe it's one of those you'd notice something and then you notice it everywhere. But how many female CEOs are we starting to see of these tech companies? It's a simple stereotype, but that ability to adroitly manage social relationships is a slightly, as is well studied, is a slightly more female than male characteristic, which is part of why I drew this. In a world with eBay and Facebook, where network connections are everything, and there's forced, you can't escape your past. You can't be the cowboy that rides into town, steals money in a kind of a net negative exchange with people, and then leaves, rides off for the next town. In a world with that degree of connectivity, the nature of work and the nature of success and the nature of great CEOs is going to change, forced by technology. And I think one of the things that was really, really interesting to watch in Second Life, and I'm not sure I still completely, grok it, understand it, was this translation toward more women leading than men. There we go. But I was going to say my final word before questions is, but remember, going back to the sawed-off beams, the masculine quality, and I'm going to say masculine rather than male, because as those who are into psychology in here know, we're all a mix, but the masculine trait that we actually are going to need more and more is the ability to exploit really disruptive changes in technology. In other words, the ability to do really crazy, even apparently stupid things that annoy, that anger or frighten people is typically a more cowboy idea. Jumping on some wild technology and building some ridiculous new product just because you think it might work is a typically more masculine feature. So I don't exactly know what's going to happen with the world, because we have this technology accelerating curve that gives us these radical opportunities, but then we have this increasingly networked world in which maintenance and success of a really large-scale business involves this dependency on networking and trust that is a great thing for all of humanity, but is something that in the history, even the near history of Microsoft, really wasn't the way things worked. And indeed, the Microsoft today is no doubt very different than the Microsoft of 20 years ago. So bring up some questions. Thank you. Here we go.
Could you talk a little bit more about being a reluctant extrovert and what that looks like for you and how you've, I guess, evolved from that or not evolved from it?
You know, I get sick. I feel sick before I go on stage. Not really sick to my stomach. I've talked to people who do that, but I do feel a little unsettled, and my hands shake a little bit. I pay attention to it. I also meditate. I loved what Yale said about my telomeres being longer. I'm so excited about that. I so don't want to age. You know, I get stressed when I'm getting up to speak. And I think the one answer is, only if you're a little bit of an introvert and uncomfortable can you put on the best, craziest performances on stage. I've really noticed this. The people who are incredibly great speakers, who are always on and are really smooth and are consistently extroverted, I always feel like they get up to this really great level, but the really insane ones that blow it out of the park always have a little bit of that discomfort in them, where they walk off the stage and they kind of, you know, go back into their shell and they have to read a book. The way I know I'm still introverted, by the way, is that I have to read. Like, after I do a presentation like this, I love it. I'm high on the narcotic feeling of, like, presenting and, you know, being impactful, but I get tired afterwards. You guys will see me tonight. I'll be like, catch me in the bar and see. I'll be kind of on a little bit of a depression low.
You talked about your experience with collaborative work and decentralizing that. Could you talk a little bit about specifically what are some of the things that make work collaborative, or how do you make that work? How do you take something and make it collaborative in a way that people will engage with it and get on board?
Well, the biggest way to make work collaborative in a project is, first of all, to be willing to have very high transparency. Seth was, let's see, there were two threads today. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Oh my God, I love that. Such a great statement. And then what you want to be willing to do is have everybody tell each other what they're doing, and then break work down into very small pieces that can be executed in parallel. That's the way to make things collaborative. And then let people share that work. Let anybody grab a project rather than assigning it to people. I mean, I don't know, that's kind of a quick answer, but okay, over here.
Okay, so in a world that's kind of what you were describing is this future work world of coffee and power, you're basically systematizing management layers. And I'm actually working on that as my company goes from 15 to 50 people. But with that, communication becomes more important for employees to be able to communicate. But is there danger, and how would you address it, of an organization becoming overly political? Because when you have that communication and that autonomy, management has a great way of squashing politics, I think. But how do you handle that?
We had a rule in Linden that I wrote, which was pretty cool, called no politics. We had this thing called the Tao of Linden, and one of them was no politics. And I wrote it, and I thought it was pretty good, so feel free to steal it and use it. My statement was, I said, anything that you do in this company which is evidently designed to improve your own position in the company or someone else's without a commensurate increase in the overall welfare of the company on its own, you're fired.
Is the Tao of Linden available online?
Yeah, you can find it. I think it's changed over the years, but if you do a Google search for Tao of Linden, you will find it. So that's one answer to part of the question. But fundamentally, you let people you let people communicate a lot, but you also make them highly accountable for making some progress. That's the other thing is, politics sometimes happens when you have enough time for it. But if you're really enthusiastically pursuing goals and trying to get stuff done, and you feel like you have to get stuff done, there's a lot less time to just, you know, talk about things. Over here.
You handed out some interesting management philosophies and different ideas that aren't normal. They're different. Could you share with us a couple of them, or one of them at least, that you might have implemented that backfired on you, or better yet, one that you thought about but it was too cutting edge that you got nervous about and didn't push out?
Sure, that's a great question. So Dan Pink, in his book Drive, wrote about autonomy, motivation, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. If you've ever interested in an interesting book about kind of what makes us work the way we work, please read Drive. One of the things I did that was really dumb and totally inconsistent with Drive, now I'm rereading Drive now and I'm like, oh, stupid. I had a thing where I gave everybody inside Linden Lab money, but instead of giving it to people as a bonus afterwards, thank you for doing such great work, wow, you know, you're surprised, oh my God, I can't believe everybody just gave me $500, it's so wonderful, you know. What we would do instead is I could basically take one of our open work items that people were working on and say, if you get that done, you get $500. Which, if you read Drive, is exactly the wrong strategy. It causes this dopamine narcotic response. It's just like offering somebody cocaine. Read the book, it's great. You don't want to do it at work, and yet the very nature of almost all work relationships is that it's motivated by these carrots. Basically, the book says carrots don't work. They demotivate people, not motivate them. And so I built a complex economy designed to much more effectively demotivate people, and it totally did. Yes.
Hi. Different cultures respond differently to different approaches. I wonder if you thought about your principles in the world is flat environment that we're in now.
So different cultures respond differently?
To different systems of motivation and work behavior.
Right.
And as there's more international collaboration, how do you see the principles that you're talking about being widely accepted, or will they be hindered as you go across cultures?
That is such a great question. I would say, honestly, I don't know. Being a real student of international culture myself, because we saw so much of it in Second Life, I've always been fascinated by questions like that. I don't really know. I think that breaking work down to smaller, highly accountable chunks is probably universally appealing. I think it's going to be consistent across cultures, but other aspects of transparency, for example, can be really interesting in cultures. I'd say it's a great question. I wish I knew more of the answers. What I hope is that work changes enough in the next few years that we like find out, you know. Yeah. We even see some of these experiments happen. I can't believe how little of the stuff that I'm talking about up there has been done by I mean, it's starting to be done by companies, and I think it's highly efficient and effective, but it's amazing how few have adopted these things. Hi, Andy.
In this world of these virtual worlds, these micro-tasked remote teams, what's the role of human contact? Do we still need to do that? What's the purpose? What are the pieces of it we need to keep, and what can go?
In a way, so what's the role of human contact? You know, in a way, Coffee and Power has been so fun for me because at Second Life we explored the very limits of what you could do with virtual presence. So we created virtual contact, and we used computers as best they exist today to allow people to touch each other as much as they could. But you know what's interesting? In a way, it also it made me get to become an expert in the nature of human contact, right? Because essentially we were decomposing everything that human contact, everything that could be done online. And so the answer is human contact is incredibly important for building trust and communicating what is essentially nonverbal information. And nonverbal information, as it's being analyzed by brain science and lots of different people, is thought to comprise of just this increasingly large percentage of the information being exchanged. The latest number is 85% of what you're telling me when we're close enough to see each other's bodies and faces is being communicated non-verbally. Dig that idea. I mean, it's just crazy. I think that's one of the challenges, by the way, with virtual worlds. Why Second Life is not 1 billion people using it is because of that 85%. That data is not being communicated. And at work, that data needs to be communicated. And so we have to solve those problems and get people together. And that's why here, for example, I was saying, Andy, that it would be so amazing if there was a place in this city where everybody that was working on tech could get together and communicate. Because what we've learned with Coffee and Power is even though we come to these conferences and we have this amazing feeling of connection when we're here, we don't routinely use that connection to facilitate our work. And that's what we're trying to do with this app, is actually to crack that nut. But I think practically speaking, in a city like this, get people to come here every day and do their work here. Just, it's a mystery as to why it'll work, but it'll just work. One more? Okay, thank you.
Can you talk about Worklist some more and the challenges you've had making it and the success stories? And if you ever plan to release it as open source or anything for other people to use it?
Say that about open source again?
For Worklist, if the challenges you've had making that piece of software.
Worklist. Right, so Worklist was this decentralized environment. What were the challenges we had with it? I think the biggest challenge was what I kind of touched on before, which was and actually that's a great closing question. We all want safety. And the perfect, beautiful efficiency of something like the work list is not in and of itself enough to give us the safety to jump into a new job. I was thinking, would you rather have on your resume, check this out, would you rather have on your resume, I spent the last year developing iPhone applications by myself, and one of those applications was in the top 10 of new applications for this year, or would you rather have your resume say, for the same period of time, I was a senior product manager at Google? There's something about the Google thing. It just makes me want to rage. Who wouldn't want to be the entrepreneur that built this thing? But what I've seen is that freelancer on your resume is not a, it doesn't have the cachet that it needs to, and that's part of what we're trying to address in part with Coffee and Power. But the big thing is that hand to mouth, contract to contract payments to people, it's not a human quality. So we need to come up with clever ways to fix that problem, even as we find more and more efficient ways to work. So I was saying, I'll throw out a closing thought, which would be, what if everybody in these three cities that are in this area here, what if a bunch of groups were formed of entrepreneurs that were working on similar projects, and you all put $5,000 a year in a pot, and you assessed each other in some SurveyMonkey-ish way, and so long as you were good enough to stay in the group, when you were between projects, the money just came out of the pot. You know, at some modest amount of money you could get as living money. It's a weird thought. It's a very collectivist kind of a thought. It's not very capitalist or market-oriented. But think how that might make you feel safe as a founding entrepreneur, as a young entrepreneur, as a new entrepreneur here in this area. And I tell you that if you did that here, you would be among, it would be one of the first places that had happened. And it's happening a little bit in Silicon Valley, but by no means all over. And we are, you know, very cold and disconnected very often there as well. Thank you very much.